Good morning, everyone. Yes, Clay also gave me this title, Fresh Ideas for Fresh Cows, and I've sort of reworked it a little bit, and I'm calling it Reconsidering Transition Cow Protein Nutrition. So I want to go back and look at some old data around protein nutrition in transition cows, just to revisit some old dogma. And I promise I could have come with that data on acetates and using an overhead projector, but I didn't. So I am going back in time a bit. But I also want to talk about some relatively new data. So, quite a bit of it is data that's only been presented at meetings and it's only published in abstract form. So it is relatively new data. And it's data that intrigues me in terms of the responses that we're seeing to supplemental protein in very early lactation. And so I just thought I'd share it with you and see what you think, okay? And whenever I talk about transition cow nutrition and transition cow metabolism, I always like to remind myself that this is not a new area of research. And Sir Kenneth Blackster, one of our most famous and accomplished ruminant nutritionists over the last century from the UK, developed the ME system, if those of you that don't know that. He actually did his PhD at the University of Reading, working at the old National Institute for Research in Dairying at Shenfield. And he did his PhD on steaming up cows, steaming up transition cows. And he showed that if you supplement cows before calving with either a starchy or a high fiber concentrate, that you would see an increase in milk yield. And steaming up, of course, was very popular back at the time. Steaming up cows, it fell out of favor because of concerns about fat cows. But one of the concerns with early lactation dairy cows that Jose's already alluded to is the negative energy balance that occurs in early lactation. It's just a hallmark of high milk yields. I think it's normal in terms of the physiology of a high yielding dairy cow. The fact that they're not able to consume enough energy in the very early stages of lactation to meet the energy requirements of the milk energy output that they're achieving, and so they mobilize body energy. And a lot of what Jose was talking about was related to negative energy balance in early lactation. And again, some old data from Hurley. This was a slaughter balance study that was conducted by Malcolm Gibb before Hurley closed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, where they showed that there was a substantial loss of body fat from dairy cows when you went from calving or the point of calving to peak milk yield to week 29. So the substantial, I think almost 100 kilograms of body fat loss in these old British Friesian cows, but relatively small losses of body protein overall. It was lower at week 29, but it was only about 8 kilograms of difference between calving and peak lactation. So a lot of more focus on fat loss and energy metabolism. But cows do experience a substantial negative protein balance in early lactation. And Alan Bell used to talk a lot about this when he was still at Cornell. And he calculated this metabolizable protein balance based on data from some of their studies, showing that cows do have a quite substantial negative protein balance, certainly up to the first week, through the first week after calving, and then protein balance recovers and they achieve a positive protein balance after about 3 weeks postpartum. Of course, this is what's happening is even more challenging when you think about some of the other physiological changes that cows are going through in very early lactation. Again, back to Malcolm Gibb's data, he showed in the first 8 weeks of calving that the gut tissues of a cow increase substantially, okay? And a lot of this is due to increases in rumen and associated stomach tissues, the omasum, the reticulum, and the abomasum. They all increase in mass. He showed the length of the small intestine of a transition cow increases by 5 meters going from calving to peak lactation, just looking. And so there's a substantial growth of these gastrointestinal tract tissues that are required to support increasing milk yield and increased intake of cows. And that has a high amino acid requirement, a high protein requirement for synthesis of those tissues. So that's happening at a time when the mammary gland also has a very high requirement for amino acids. The increase in milk yield is also associated with a quite substantial requirement for glucose. So milk has a fairly constant concentration of lactose, and it requires glucose to synthesize that lactose. We were talking about Frank Anderson earlier, Jose. Frank Anderson showed in some really, some very classic work that the mammary gland utilizes about 70% of the glucose it takes up for lactose it synthesizes, uses the other 30% for providing energy for fat synthesis and other purposes. So we can, using Anderson's figures, we can calculate how much glucose is required per kilogram of milk produced. So our cows in very early lactation, they start producing large amounts of milk, and that has a very high requirement for glucose. So where is that glucose coming from? In ruminants, most of that glucose is coming from gluconeogenesis. It's synthesized in the liver and the kidneys, but primarily in the liver. And one of the important precursors for that glucose synthesis is amino acids. So the glucose can be synthesized from propionate and other long-chain isovolatile fatty acids. The primary glucose precursor is propionate, and it can also be synthesized from lactate, from glycerol, a certain amount of glycerol, and it can be synthesized from the non-essential amino acids and most of the essential amino acids as well. So this increase in glucose production by the liver and that increased requirement for glucose precursors is often cited as a reason for a low milk protein response in early lactation. The dogma is that high glucose synthesis in early lactation utilizes amino acids for glucose synthesis that limits their availability for milk protein synthesis and milk production, okay? And you often see this in the literature. There's frequently an implication that that large increase in glucose production limits amino acid availability for protein synthesis in early lactation. A good example is lots of studies have been conducted which showed that increased bypass starch and increased glucose absorption from the small intestine increases milk protein concentration and milk protein yield. And that's put down to the fact, it's assumed that that's because, okay, there's less gluconeogenesis required, so we don't need amino acids for glucose synthesis, therefore we get an increase in milk protein yield. And it really is dogma in the literature if you read through the literature, sorry. So I want to look at some data that we produced back in the day when I was much younger and I had more time to spend in the barn with cows. We used a technique that we call a multi-catheterization approach that Jose referred to earlier. So I want to show you some data from some studies we conducted that sort of challenge this dogma about glucose synthesis limiting the availability of amino acids for milk protein in early lactation. So this is a surgical procedure where we establish catheters in blood vessels associated with the gastrointestinal tract and liver of ruminants. And then we can measure venous arterial concentration differences and blood flow rates across these tissues. So for example, we can put a catheter into the hepatic portal vein and have a catheter in an artery. We can then, if we use an indicator dilution technique, we can estimate blood flow through that portal vein, and then we can calculate what we call a portal drain visceral flux. It's portal vein minus arterial concentration difference times portal flow, okay? And that tells us the net flux, the net rate of appearance of a nutrient, say, for example, lactate that might be being absorbed into the portal vein. It doesn't tell us the true absorption rate because there's going to be some lactate taken up from arterial blood, but it's a net availability, a net absorption of lactate. If we put a catheter in a hepatic vein, we can also measure venous arterial differences in blood flow across the liver, calculate a net flux across the liver. The entire tissue bed is what we call the total splanchnic tissues, and that's the portal drain viscera plus liver tissues. And that's simply hepatic vein minus arterial concentration difference. So based on that, there's been a number of studies conducted by ourselves, back in the day, and other researchers. So one question would be, if the amino acids are required for glucose synthesis, would infusing more of these amino acids or other glucose precursors increase glucose production? Okay, so there's been a number of studies conducted using these multi-catheterization techniques, oftentimes using a mesenteric vein infusion to mimic an increased absorption of those nutrients. And across these studies, mesenteric vein infusion of alanine, a very important glucose precursor, propionate, or mixtures of non-essential amino acids, they've never shown an increase or an effect on glucose output. What happens is there's a decrease in lactate removal. And remember, if you think back to your nutritional physiology and biochemistry, the Cori cycle is the process of metabolizing glucose in peripheral tissues to lactate. So it's 6 carbons to 2 3-carbon molecules. And then that lactate coming back to the liver to be resynthesized as glucose. So it's cycling carbons. And that's what happens. You provide more of the other glucose precursors. You don't increase glucose production. That's set, physiologically set, it's hormonally determined, et cetera. So you just reduce the amount of Cori cycling, reduce the amount of lactate removed. And for example, this was a study we conducted a number of years ago where we had multi-catheterized cows. They were fed a very low protein diet, below the requirements for metabolizable protein. We then took measurements of net flux across these splanchnic tissues as a control, and then we infused a mixture of the total amino acids that would be in 600 grams of casein, so a similar amino acid profile to milk protein, the essentials in that mixture, or just the non-essentials. And we infused them for 3 days, and then we sampled again. And what happened was we didn't see any significant increases in glucose production. There were numerical increases, but they weren't significant. The essentials had no effect on lactate or urea production by the liver. But when we infused the totals, there was a significant increase in urea production, but no change in lactate. When we infused the non-essentials on their own, and at the time everybody was saying, well, these non-essentials are so important for glucose production, we thought we would see an increase in milk yield through providing more non-essential amino acids, because these animals were fed below their metabolizable protein requirements. We didn't see any increase in glucose production, but we saw an increase in lactate flux. So in other words, this substitution of decreased Cori cycling, and a big increase in urea production as well. If you look at the milk yield response of those animals, we had a significant increase in milk yield with the total amino acids, but not with the non-essential amino acids. We actually saw a decrease in milk yield when we infused the non-essential amino acids on their own, without the essential amino acids. And that was reflected with milk protein concentration, where we saw an increase with the totals and the essentials. So there was an essential providing those essential amino acids increased milk protein concentration. Providing the non-essentials on their own actually had a negative effect. It decreased milk protein concentration. Another way we've looked at this is through, and Jose, thanks for mentioning this paper. This was a paper we published a number of years ago, where we actually measured net flux of nutrients of cows through the transition period. So these cows had been catheterized in their previous lactation, and then we obtained measurements of their metabolism. We were targeting at 10-day intervals before expecting calving date, and then we obtained measurements at 10-day intervals approximately after they calved. So we had measurements at almost 3 weeks, at 10 days before calving, and then at 11, 22, and 33 days after calving, and then again at peak at 83 days postpartum. And you can see the increases in dry matter intake of these cows and the increases in milk yield that occurred after calving. They hit 40 kilograms of milk per day on average. These were 5 cows at about 3 weeks postpartum. And if we look at flux of glucose across the splanchnic tissues of the cows, you can see before calving that liver glucose production is fairly stable. There's no net portal drain visceral flux absorption of glucose. If anything, it's slightly negative, which means there's no net absorption from the small intestine of the cows. With calving and the increase in milk yield, there's large increases in liver glucose production and total splanchnic supply. Okay? If we look at the removal of precursors for glucose that could potentially be used for glucose production across the liver, at calving, there's a large increase in lactate removal by the liver, and total splanchnic flux of lactate becomes very negative. As the cows progress through lactation and reach peak, then their total splanchnic release of lactate, or flux of lactate, becomes a net release. They start releasing lactate to peripheral tissues rather than lactate on a net basis coming back to the liver, where it can be used for glucose synthesis. The other major amino acid, again, that is an important glucose precursor, but like lactate, can be used to cycle carbon from peripheral tissues from glucose metabolism as a 3-carbon unit. It can bring carbon back to the liver. So in a sense, lactate's acting like, alanine is acting like lactate. We see there's a large increase in alanine removal by the liver immediately after calving, and then the rate of removal starts to decrease. So they show, the alanine shows that yes, there is an increased removal by the liver to support glucose production. We looked at other glucose precursors as well, propionate, the isovolatile fatty acids, and glycerol. And if we sum up the maximum possible carbon contribution to of those precursors that were removed to the glucose that was produced, we can't account for all the glucose produced. And so presumably the other carbon were the other amino acids that we didn't measure. But the minimum difference that we measured was actually immediately after calving. And if these amino acids are required for glucose production, we would have expected that difference to be greatest immediately after calving, which suggests to us that there isn't this obligate requirement for amino acids for glucose production in very early lactation. The carbon's provided by lactate that comes from co-recycling. And Mogens Larsen and Niels Christensen in Denmark have done a lot of work using this same approach. And they assembled data from, I think, 4 studies that were using transition dairy cows and came to the same conclusion. And they emphasized the importance of lactate and co-recycling to the very early lactation dairy cows. And again, emphasized that that increased gluconeogenesis in very early lactation dairy cows does not have a negative effect on the availability of amino acids on a quantitative basis for milk yield and milk protein yield. Okay? So no evidence of an increase in essential, and certainly apart from alanine, any amino acid utilization. And Niels and Mogens looked at all the different amino acids in their metabolism across the liver. No evidence of an increase in their utilization for glucose synthesis in early lactation, but an increased alanine and lactate uptake by the liver, reflecting this cycling of carbon from peripheral tissues back to the liver. And splanchnic lactate balance does reflect body energy balance. But we do know that we can see responses in terms of milk protein yield and energy-corrected milk to supplemental essential amino acid provision during transition. And this is some of the study from some of the data from the Illinois study showing effects of feeding for, I think it was 6 weeks before calving through transition, showing increases in milk yield and energy-corrected milk yield with the provision of that supplemental rumen-protected methionine. Not all studies, not all transition studies have shown beneficial effects of supplemental methionine, and in this case, supplemental rumen-protected methionine and lysine. A study from Ohio State, where they fed supplemental rumen-protected methionine and lysine to cows for 3 weeks before expected calving date, and then for 3 weeks after calving. And then they measured production through week 13, and there were no significant effects on milk yield. There was a significant increase in milk protein concentration in weeks 2 and 3 postpartum, when the supplemental rumen-protected methionine lysine were fed after calving, but no effects before calving. But one question would be, how quickly does the postpartum cow benefit from that supplementation? Cows are often experiencing inappetence immediately after calving, especially if they've had a hard calving. So you've supplemented their diet, but how do you know, how much are they actually eating of that supplemental protein, or that metabolizable protein, or those rumen-protected amino acids? That inappetence will delay the availability of those amino acids to the cow until she starts eating. So one way, and these are the studies that are really intriguing as far as I'm concerned. One way to approach this is to use an abomasal infusion technique. So if you have a cow that's got a rumen cannula, you can put an abomasal infusion line through the rumen into the abomasum, and you can infuse proteins or amino acids directly into the abomasum post-ruminally for absorption. And so one approach is to use that technique and begin your infusions as soon as the cow calves. And this was something that Mogens Larsen and Niels Christensen did as part of Mogens' PhD, looking at responses to glucose. We all talk about this high requirement for glucose with high levels of milk yield, and that glucose limiting milk production. So Mogens and Niels thought, well, okay, let's infuse glucose directly into the abomasum for absorption, starting as soon as the cow's calves. So these infusions, they infuse 1,500 grams of glucose per day. They incrementally increased it, I think, over 2 or 3 days. And then they infuse 1.5 kilograms of glucose into the abomasum of the cows, starting within 6 hours after the cows calved. And what do you think happened? Did milk yield increase? Milk yield was significantly reduced. Significantly reduced. And why? Because the dry matter intake of the cows was reduced. Glucose has effects on a number of hormones that affect appetite. So the cows thought, oh, I'm getting enough energy, I don't need to eat anymore. So they stopped eating, and they didn't have any protein. They didn't have any other nutrients for milk yield, so milk yield dropped. So it was a bit of a disappointment for Mogens and Niels, but then they thought, well, okay, what happens if we do the same thing with protein? What happens if we infuse casein? And they infused casein, I think it was about 600 to 800 grams of casein that was solubilized and infused into the abomasum beginning immediately after calving. They saw an increase in milk yield that was sustained. It was immediate. At some points, it was 9 to 10 kilograms of increased milk yield per day. And it was, they infused it. They actually started infusing it and then incrementally reduced the infusion rate as the intakes of the cows increased, okay, to try to maintain a constant supply of MP. And that's what they did. This is the metabolizable protein supply to the cows. So as the intake of the control cows increased and as the intake of the cows increased, they gradually dialed down their casein infusion. So at the end of the infusion, the metabolizable protein supply was virtually the same, and yet milk yield was still, what is that? It's about 8 kilograms of an increase. This is a substantial amount of milk yield response to these cows. And dry matter intake of the cows wasn't affected, okay? Mogens then went and did a study with Alain Lapierre, one of our former postdocs at Quebec, with multi-catheterized cows. And in this case, they infused the same amounts of amino acids, but as the free amino acids rather than as the casein. And they got a similar effect. And if anything, they had a greater sort of carryover effect in terms of a sustained effect with increased milk yield. Which suggested to me that there might be more than just supplying amino acids to meet a requirement, but actually perhaps signaling in terms of things like leucine and mTOR, turning on protein synthesis, and some of the things Jose was talking about in terms of impacting the physiology of the cow, the mammary gland, that result in a sustained increase in milk production. So I think it's very, very, very interesting. And then, as part of our Smart Cow EU dairy cattle research infrastructure project, where they repeated this, but in this case, they infused the total amino acids in casein. I think it was about 800 grams of casein per day, or just the essential amino acids in the total mixture, okay? And this has only been published in abstract form, but Balu presented it at EAAP 2 years ago. But after the 5th day of infusion, they started incrementally reducing the amount infused to 0 at 35 days. And this just shows the milk yield responses for the total period from day 1 to 50 postpartum. And you can see, again, with the total infusion, they got a substantial increase, again, about 8 kilograms of milk per day increase on average over the course of that period. But with the essential amino acids, they didn't get as much response, suggesting that there wasn't enough provision of non-essential amino acids through de novo synthesis to meet the milk protein requirements for that increased yield they achieved with the totals, suggesting that the non-essentials were required for that milk protein response. And that increase in milk yield was sustained through 50 days in milk, so it continued after the infusion stopped. So how can we achieve this through just supplemental feeding? So we did a study in collaboration with Mole Valley, Chris Bartram at Mole Valley. He came to us, was really excited about a study he'd seen in the literature, and he was talking about the Illinois study, and I thought he was talking about Moen's study. And for about half an hour, we were talking about doing a trial, and I was talking about repeating Moen's trial. But anyway, so we ended up formulating a supplement based on prairie meal or corn gluten meal, which has a high RUP value, and supplemented with rumen-protected methionine, rumen-protected lysine, and rumen-protected histidine. And what we did was we formulated the amount that we were providing to provide the same amount of leucine, methionine, lysine, and histidine that were in that Moen's casein treatment, based on some work that had been done at INRA, showing that the milk protein yield of cows could be maintained when they were put on a low protein diet through abomasal infusion of those 4 amino acids, those essential amino acids. So that's what we were trying to achieve. And so we were trying to supplement cows by top dressing in very early lactation, and they wouldn't eat the supplement. Chris was just flabbergasted because he said he never had problems with cows eating corn gluten meal. They wouldn't touch it. We mixed it with molasses, we tried everything, but they just would not eat enough of it in early lactation. So we thought, okay, what can we do? Instead of feeding it, we used a rumen drench. So we made up a warm slurry of this supplement, and we drenched the cows. And then the control cows just had warm tap water as their control. Because of home office regulations, we could only drench the cows for 4 days. So we drenched the cows within 8 hours of calving, and then followed their production for 12 weeks. So again, this was an oral drench of 30 liters of warm water without or with this supplement, rumen unprotected protein supplement and rumen protected essential amino acids. It was just a preliminary study. We only had 10 cows per treatment. And so we were dosing the cows with a substantial amount of this supplement. And this was for 4 days after calving. So we maintained them in our calving box for 7 days. They went back into our main yard. They went on the kaolin gates, and we monitored their intakes and milk yields for 12 weeks. And what did we find? We didn't see any significant effects on intake or milk yield. Numerically, milk yield was over 2 kilos greater when we supplemented with the rumen drench, but there was a lot of variability. It was only 10 cows per treatment. So that numerical increase in milk yield wasn't significant. There was a significant increase in milk fat concentration. So 4 days of supplementation increased milk fat concentration. It was maintained for 12 weeks. There was also an increase in milk protein concentration, only at 0.08, and again, it was maintained for 12 weeks with 4 days of supplementation. So a carryover effect was obvious. Energy-corrected milk yield, again, not significant. There was an interesting interaction between the supplement and time, a week of lactation, for body weight. So the cows that were supplemented, they gained about 32 kilograms of body weight over the first 12 weeks postpartum. And the cows that weren't supplemented they actually lost 3 kilos over that first 12 weeks. And you oftentimes, I've gone back and looked at a lot of studies in the literature. We don't focus enough on body weight responses to our protein supplements in randomized controlled trials. There are oftentimes body weight effects of protein supplementation. So our conclusions were that 4 daily rumen doses of this RUP product, a prairie meal along with rumen-protected methionine, lysine, and histidine, beginning immediately after calving, within 8 hours after calving, had positive effects on fat and protein concentrations that were sustained through 12 weeks postpartum. And there was also a body weight response. Those cows increased their body weight by 32 kilograms with no gain in the controls. And we just feel like further research is warranted. I'm still intrigued that perhaps there may be metabolic signaling occurring that's causing carryover effects. But if this is going to be used in practice, we need effective dietary supplements. Bill Weiss conducted a study. My colleague, I've just been 4 years at Ohio State from 2002 to 2006. I had the pleasure of sharing a lab with Bill Weiss from Ohio State. Bill conducted a study where they used a metabolizable protein supplement. It was Amino Plus, which means nothing to me. It's an American product. It's heat-treated soybean, okay, similar to soy pass probably in this country, and either corn gluten meal, again prairie meal, as a source of MP, or a spray dried blood meal product to balance methionine and lysine. So that's the MPAA. So they fed these supplements starting 3 days after calving for 3 weeks, and then they followed their production again for 12 weeks, like in our study. Okay, and in this case, there was no significant effect on milk yield. The blood meal product did show a sustained benefit in terms of milk protein concentration, but like in our study, milk fat concentration was significantly increased through 12 weeks postpartum following 3 weeks supplementation with the metabolizable protein. Okay, so very similar responses. Moens has been doing, again, following on from the work he did with casein and amino acid infusion, has been working on developing a metabolizable protein product that can be fed in early lactation to try to mimic the responses they get with casein. And there's a Danish company, DLG, who has a product called Easy Boost. It's 50% soy pass. Sorry, no, it's soy pass and it's prairie meal again. So it's 50% corn gluten and 25% soy pass. And they've been feeding it in robots as a supplement to cows after calving, or using computerized feeders after calving. So in this study, they fed this product, Easy Boost, at a rate of 4 kilograms per day to cows, and they had a group of cows that were fed the product for 28 days, or a control group that wasn't fed the product. And then they had another group of cows that were fed the product for 7 days and then went on to a common diet, or they were fed the product for 7 days and then went on to a diet that had higher metabolizable protein, thinking if they had an increase in milk yield, they'd provide more MP to maintain the response. These cows that were on the 28-day boost, for the first 7 days, they got the 4 kilograms per day, and then they gradually decreased the amount fed, just like they did with the casein infusion study. And again, this was published at the EAAP meeting 2 years ago. And so what they found was that there was no significant effect on intake or energy-corrected milk yield, although numerically, the energy-corrected milk yield was higher for the cows that had the 7-day boost, and then whether or not they had the higher normal protein afterwards. But for energy-corrected milk yield per unit dry matter intake, or feed efficiency, they did see a significant improvement with the 7-day boost at 4 weeks postpartum. One thing to note is that they had 10 cows that would not eat this product. They said it was a problem with the the computerized feeders, but it sounded like a very familiar story to me that the cows were not eating this high prairie meal product. They had 3 cows here and other cows here that would not eat the product, so they were removed from the study. So, thank you for listening to some of my ramblings about some of this data. Protein is limiting milk yield in very early lactation. I don't think there's any question about that. Amino acid use for glucose synthesis, however, does not appear to be obligatory in early lactation, and it does not limit essential amino acid supply. Those amino acids contributing carbon to glucose production, they're amino acids that are being catabolized because they're available in amounts that are greater than that are required. Okay, so when they're catabolized, their carbon can contribute to glucose production. Liver lactate and alanine uptake does increase in very early lactation. So supplementing metabolizable protein immediately, and that's within hours after calving, will increase milk yield substantially. And it does that without increasing dry matter intake. We used an early postpartum rumen drench for 4 days, and it increased milk fat and protein concentrations through 12 weeks postpartum and had positive effects on body weight. I think I'd like to see more. I don't have time. I'm too close to retirement. I'm not going to have time to sort this, to ask all the questions and try to get some answers that I'd like to, for the questions I'd like to ask. But I do think further research is warranted. It'd be good to know more about the balance of essential and non-essential amino acids that are needed to maximize the response. I think the study with Moens is intriguing, where they didn't get as much of a response just with the essentials. That's not been the case for other types of studies, but that's for cows in very early lactation. I think there is some metabolic signaling that's contributing to the carryover effects, and I think it'd be good to see if we can come up with some effective postpartum supplements that cows will consistently eat. And perhaps rumen drenches combined with those supplements might be a way to kickstart cows and to give them a fresh start, Clay. So thank you very much.